So, Farron, of course, the Wisconsin primary this week, Bernie Sanders won much bigger from a percentage standpoint than was anticipated. Final results came in about 56% for Bernie Sanders, 43% for Hillary Clinton. That translates into 47 delegates for Sanders, 36 for Clinton. And you'll notice, I mean, this is one of the challenges that Bernie Sanders has in terms of coming back, is that we're are in that on the Democratic side, things are proportional, and despite the fact that he won by almost 13%, he only ends up with about 20, or I should say, another extra 10 delegates. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, 48% Ted Cruz wins, quite big, 35% to Trump, 14 to Kasich. And if you look at Cruz, he won 36 delegates versus Trump's 6, Kasich 0. And so that's the difference between the Republican and the Democratic side. They are not as proportional in terms of the way they divvy up their delegates. And this means, staying with the Republicans for a moment, Farron, this means that the Republican Party is inching closer to the sort of the Armageddon scenario for Cleveland in July.
We're headed towards what the Koch brothers want, which is the Paul Ryan scenario. At this point, it's becoming harder and harder for any one of those candidates. Kasich has absolutely no shot statistically of being the nominee, but we're almost to the point where it will be impossible for either Cruz or Trump to get enough delegates, because there simply are just not as many left on the Republican side. New York, if Cruz can take New York, we're headed to a contested convention, and that could be phenomenal. It could also be an outright, one of the worst things we've seen in modern politics. But they want to do anything to get rid of Donald Trump. And to be honest, the party leadership, they don't want Ted Cruz either. And so that's why we're hearing so much about Paul Ryan. We're hearing so much from Paul Ryan, because that's the backup guy. That is the guy that they think is going to save if they can, go to this contested convention, which is what the leadership, wants to happen.
Let's be clear on what the situation is here now. Trump is going to win New York. There's no doubt about that. The question is, even if he wins New York and sweeps the Northeast states, including Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Connecticut, it is still unclear that he's going to be able to get, and really it'll come down to California, to see if he can get to 1237. Now, that's the rule as it stands today. You need the majority, not the plurality, but the majority of delegates, and that number is 1237. Right now, the speculation is that Donald Trump is going to come somewhere between 1150 and 1236. And there's no chance for Ted Cruz to get a majority of delegates. Now, as the rules stand today, the first ballot is voted upon. If no one receives the majority of delegates, it will go to a second ballot. All those pledged delegates are no longer tied to the candidates who won them in the primary or the caucus. There is a rule number 40, which was instituted for Mitt Romney's benefit, to keep Ron Paul out of the second ballot if it came down to it, which says you have to win 8 states, or the delegates from 8 states, to qualify for round 2. Right now, that would only be Cruz and Trump. Now, then the question becomes, who's going to control the rules committee? If it's Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, then those rules, Rule 40, will stand. But if somehow Donald Trump ends up overpowering Ted Cruz, maybe they'll put in a new rule that says you have to have won 10 states. Or it's possible, if the Republican establishment wins out, and this is your Paul Ryan scenario, where you had to win no states whatsoever. I mean, this is what the Rules Committee does. It's perfectly legitimate because the party can do what they want. But here's the key numbers, Farron, which suggest that no matter what happens, the Republicans are screwed. The Wisconsin exit poll data. Now, Wisconsin is a fairly moderate state, particularly in terms of process, right? I mean, we know that Republicans in Wisconsin, and just Wisconsinites in general, would not vote out Scott Walker because on a recall, because they just didn't like the idea of it. Here was the question of Wisconsin preliminary primary voters. If there is no candidate who wins a majority of delegates, in other words, 1237, how many people of the Republican voters think that the candidate with the most votes, with the plurality, should be the nominee? Well, Trump voters, 83%. That's no surprise, right? But listen to this. All voters combined, 56%. Kasich and Cruz voters think 41%. Of course, the opposite is true. Should you let the delegates decide? So in other words, this is a very volatile situation. When you have 83% of Trump voters think that he should get it, even if he doesn't get to halfway, but almost exactly half of Republicans think that it should go to the guy who wins the majority of, the plurality of delegates. So you're going to have, just on process alone, never mind how polarizing both Cruz and Trump are to Republicans, half of the Republican Party thinks that you should let the delegates decide, and half think it should just go to the guy who wins the most delegates coming in. So the recipe here is incredibly volatile.
You know, the great irony of all this, the real humor, is the fact that we have a lot of people on the Democratic side who say, man, I wish we had the Republican method for delegates. And the Republicans are saying, man, we wish we had the Democratic part with the super delegate. Everybody wants everybody else's system because they think it's better, but it's so humorous. And for the first time, at least in my, lifetime being involved in any of this, it seems like both sides are kind of unhappy in general with the entire primary process. So maybe the best thing we can hope for out of all this is that after all of this ends and the smoke settles, maybe we'll get some rewriting of the rules. Maybe something different will happen to where we won't end up in these situations in the future. I mean, on the Democratic side,
don't hold your breath, buddy.
Well, on the Democratic side, we have so many delegates, and we have 500 super delegates, and we just create these arbitrary numbers out of nothing. The rules within the party itself are made up by the party. Same thing with the Republicans. So it really is whatever the party decides is what they're able to do, and that's where we get our presidential nominees.
Yeah, that is the case. I mean, I don't know. Every year the party changes the rules and we've seen it on the Democratic side too. But the parties change the rules to try and get the candidate that is most preferable to sort of the party apparatus, and they always seem to get it wrong. So we get this sort of comedy of errors. But here is why they are faced with basically two choices. Do they want a disaster, or do they want a catastrophe in the general election? And here's what I mean by that. Exit polling from the Wisconsin Republican primary this week. All Republicans are asked this question. Who would you vote for in November if Trump was the nominee? 61% of Republicans said they would vote for Trump. Only 6 in 10 Republican primary goers in Wisconsin would vote for Trump. 20% would vote for a third party. 10% would vote for Hillary Clinton if she was the nominee of the Democrats. And almost 10% would not vote. That is a disaster for the Republican Party. But it doesn't end there, Farron, because let's look at the catastrophe option. That is, asked of all Republicans, if Ted Cruz was your nominee going against Hillary Clinton in the general election, who would you vote for? Well, about 60% said Ted Cruz of Republicans. 20% of Republicans said they'd vote for a third party. About 10% said they'd vote for Hillary Clinton. And about 10% said they wouldn't vote. So if you're a Republican establishment person, you got to either pick the disaster that Ted Cruz is, or the catastrophe that Donald Trump is, or you got to go in and alienate all those sets of people, which could bring the numbers down. Who knows what it would be if it was Paul Ryan at that point, and they were able to sort of pull shenanigans and get Paul Ryan in there. They are looking at Armageddon.